So while you guys are working on your narratives, you are going to have to incorporate some dialogue in your rough drafts because, of course, if we're writing a narrative, we have to have our characters talking back and forth, and that means we need to know how to correctly use and punctuate dialogue in our narratives. So the first thing that we need to know about dialogue is where to put our punctuation. So when we are writing dialogue, the first thing that you're going to need to know is that all punctuation marks, whether they're periods, commas, exclamation points, question marks, will always go inside the quotation marks. There is rarely a situation where your punctuation will go outside of quotation marks, so always remember to put those punctuation marks inside of the quotation marks. Again, whether it's a comma, a period, exclamation point, question marks, those always go inside of the quotation marks. And you can see the example on the screen as to where those punctuation marks go. So in our first example, wash the dishes immediately, comma, said mom. We know we have to have that comma there. It's going to go inside of the quotation marks. Same thing in that last one. Tim said, I don't want to, period, and quotation marks. So the quotation marks are always going to go around the punctuation. So the next thing that you're going to need to know about for dialogue is something called a speech tag. So I have an example of a speech tag circled on the slide. Anything that is a he said, she said, Bob said, Sally said, those are all called speech tags. So a speech tag is essentially identifying the speaker of the dialogue. So what happens when we have speech tags is we need to separate our speech tag from the dialogue with a comma. So anytime you have a speech tag, a comma is always going to come before or after that speech tag. So in our example, it says, he said, do not go in the water. Well, we need to separate that speech tag, he said, and our dialogue, do not go in the water, with a comma. So anytime we have that speech tag coming before our dialogue, we have to put the comma right before the dialogue. Now, in the other example, it's the exact same dialogue being said, but we've moved our speech tag to the end of the dialogue. So it says, do not go in the water, he said. Every time we have a speech tag coming against that dialogue, we have to separate it out with a comma. So do not go in the water, comma, he said. So whether or not that speech tag is coming before your dialogue or after the dialogue, you have to separate it out with a comma. So like anything in the English language, we always have exceptions to our rules. There will be two instances where you will never put a comma before or after a speech tag. The first one is if you are ever using an exclamation point. If you use an exclamation point in your dialogue and there's a speech tag that comes after it, you would not put a comma there. The reason why is you can't put a comma next to an exclamation point because you can't have two punctuation marks next to each other. For example, it says, watch out. We have that exclamation there ending our dialogue. Therefore, since that exclamation point is there, we would not put a comma before that speech tag, warned John. The next time that you will never use a comma is if you are using a question mark. So it follows the same rule as the exclamation point. So if you are saying, did you hear what he said? Question mark, asked Sarah. Yes, you have that dialogue followed by a speech tag, but since you're using a question mark, you will leave just the question mark and you will not put a comma. Capitalization is something that is really important to dialogue. You always need to make sure that you are capitalizing the first letter of dialogue. Now, if you look at this example, we have that he said, do not go in the water example again. What you need to notice about this is that the H in he in our speech tag is capitalized because it starts the sentence. However, you will also notice that the D in do is capitalized as well. You need to have both of those things capitalized when you are writing dialogue. It does not matter where the speech tag comes, you always need to make sure that you are capitalizing the very first letter of dialogue. So one more rule for capitalization with dialogue is that speech tags are never capitalized unless they start a sentence. So the only time that you'll ever capitalize those speech tags is if it comes at the very beginning of a sentence. So if that speech tag is coming after the dialogue, you will never capitalize those speech tags. So in our example, he said, do not go in the water. The H is capitalized in he because it's starting the sentence. Whereas in that second example, do not go in the water, he said, since that speech tag is coming at the end, you would not capitalize it. While you guys are working on your narratives, you're really going to have to pay attention to how you are formatting your dialogue. So one thing that you need to know is that you cannot have two characters talking on the same line of text. So every time your speaker changes, you hit enter and then tab. So all new dialogue that you start needs to start with you hitting enter and then tab, because that dialogue needs to be separated out from the rest of your writing. Now, every time that the speaker changes, you also have to hit enter and then tab. So you will have all of your dialogue will be indented, and then every time the speaker changes, it will be on a new line of text. And if that sounds a little bit confusing, I have an example for you guys on the next slide. All right, guys, so here is an example for you of what your dialogue should look like in your narratives. Now, look at that very first paragraph that is on the example. This is an example that I took from Harry Potter. So we can see in that first paragraph that J.K. Rowling has just given us a description of what is going on. That is her narration. Now, after that paragraph, she has some dialogue in there that she has included. You will notice that the first thing that she has done is when she starts her dialogue, she separates out that dialogue from her narration. And in order to do that, you need to hit enter and then tab. So in this dialogue, we have Harry and his uncle Vernon. They are having a conversation. So when Harry starts talking, and where that first arrow is, we have to hit enter, then tab over to show that our dialogue is starting. So all dialogue will be indented. You will also notice that the first letter of the dialogue is also capitalized. So if we look at our second arrow, our speaker has changed. So Harry's talking first, and then the speaker changes to Uncle Vernon. Since our speaker is changing, we need to hit enter and tab to tab over to show that our speaker has changed. For the third arrow, the speaker changes again. It goes back to Harry. So once Harry starts talking again, we need to hit enter and tab to show that our speaker has changed. And again, for the fourth arrow, Uncle Vernon is talking. So since the speaker changed again, we have to hit enter and tab. So all of your dialogue should look just like this. Anytime your speaker changes, remember guys, enter and tab. So all of that dialogue is indented. Use this as an example while you guys are working, because this is exactly what your dialogue is supposed to look like.